مساء الخير أو صباح الخير على حسب كل حد فيكم بيسمع المحاضرة إمتى. أنا بس عايزة أبدأ المحاضرة النهاردة بإن أنا أقول لكم قد إيه أنا مفتقدة إن أنا أتواجد معاكم في نفس الكلاس روم، وإن إحنا يبقى في بينا الانتراكشن اللي إحنا متعودين عليه. تتكلموا وأزعق لكم وأقول لكم هخرجكم بره لو اتكلمتوا، أسألكم أسئلة مختلفة تردوا عليا سواء صح سواء غلط، نتناقش. يعني فكرة إن مفيش بينا الهيومن انتراكشن اللي إحنا متعودين عليه إلى حد ما صعبة، مصعبة عليا الأمر في إن أنا أبقى بشرح لنفسي تقريبا. بس يعني في ظل الظروف اللي احنا فيها وفي ظل الإمكانيات المتاحة لينا احنا بنحاول نعمل أقصى حاجة نقدر نعملها وربنا يسهل. زي ما انتوا شفتوا بنحاول ان احنا ننزل لكم المحاضرات سواء كانت فيديو متسجل في الكلية او سواء كانت المحاضرات باوربوينت وعليها الفويس نوت. بنحاول نكلاريفاي as much as possible الشرح على المحاضرة. however لو اي حد فيكم عنده اي مشكله او اي تساؤل ابعتوا لي على الايميل وان شاء الله انا او استاذه رضوى وبنرد عليكم على طول ان شاء الله. الحاجه الثانيه ان انا برضو ما زلت بنزل لكم البي دي اف فايلز بتاعه المحاضرات زي ما احنا متعودين على المودل، بحيث برضو تبقى معاكم تقدروا تبصوا عليها. واي حد برضو عنده اي مشكله يا ريت يتواصل معايا. يا رب كلكم تبقوا كويسين واهلكم واصحابكم وحبايبكم، وربنا يسهل ونعدي الفترة دي على خير، ونحاول احنا الاثنين مع بعض من ناحيتي ومن ناحيتكم نستفيد بقدر الامكان ونقلل اي مشكلة ممكن تقابلنا، فربنا يسهل ان شاء الله. طيب today we will start chapter 9. This is the second part of the trade policies section of our course, or the trade restrictions. As we have mentioned before, trade restrictions could be divided into our two main parts, tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And we have seen, we have studied already and covered the tariff barriers in the previous chapter, chapter 8. We have also seen that imposing the tariff would result or maybe result in costs or losses for the overall economy. We have seen that it has different effects for the different groups inside the economy, producers, consumers, the government, and that the net effect, the interaction between these different groups resulted in a negative effect on the overall economy. However, again, please take care that this is the economic point of view. Other concerns could be taken into consideration that maybe would result in a different conclusion. These different factors, the non-economic factors, we will cover at the end of chapter 9. However, from the economic point of view, the most probable effect would be a negative effect on the overall economy due to the loss of efficiency, as we have seen. In this chapter, chapter 9 is under the title of non-tariff trade barriers and new protectionism. We will mainly cover other types of trade barriers, trade restrictions, and we will end the chapter with the different views concerning protectionism versus free trade, and why, if we have negative economic effects of imposing restrictions, why would this lead to, why would countries still apply different restrictions on their trade?
So this chapter will cover or will include four main parts. The first part is an introduction, where we will cover what we are going to do throughout the chapter and why, and this is actually what I'm doing right now. And then we will shift to the different types of trade non-tariff barriers that we are going to cover in this chapter. We will start with the import quotas, and then we will cover many other types of non-tariff barriers like voluntary export restraints, international cartels, standards, anti-dumping actions, and so on. This chapter will end with the political economy of protectionism, which is the part where we will try to understand how the advocates of protectionism call for protectionism and why. What are the different arguments that they base their argument on? What are the benefits of protectionism versus free trade? So, tariffs أو التعريفة الجمركية It was the main tool by which countries protected their economy or imposed restrictions on their trade with other countries for a very long time. However, and after the War II, after the GATT and then the WTO, we would find that tariffs decreased dramatically in the overall picture of the world, especially in developed countries and also in developing countries, but to a lesser extent. However, with this decrease in uh, tariffs imposed by different countries, we found that the non tariff barriers or the other tools through which countries protected their trade increased to like compensate for this decrease in the tariffs applied all over the world. And this decrease in tariffs were mainly due to the negotiations and the results of the different rounds of the GATT or the WTO afterwards. So اللي احنا بنقوله هنا ان على الرغم من ان التعريفة الجمركية كانت هي اكتر التولز اللي كانت مستخدمة لحماية التجارة باختلاف مستوى الدول، هنلاقي ان بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية بدأت أهمية التعريفة الجمركية تنخفض، بمعنى ان التعريفة الجمركية الريت نفسه بدأ ينخفض، ولكن تم استبدال أو تعويض هذا الانخفاض في الحماية باستخدام التعريفة الجمركية من خلال ال different other actions or the non-tariff barriers زي الامبورت كوتاز، زي الفولنتري اكسبورت ريسترينز، زي الانتي دامبينج اكشنز. وده كان مينلي نتيجة ان حصل انخفاض في التعريفة الجمركية بسبب مفاوضات الجات، ان من خلال الجات واللي بعد كده تحولت الى منظمة التجارة العالمية، دول العالم المختلفة كانت بتتفق على تخفيض التعريفة الجمركية وتحرير التجارة من التعريفة الجمركية. However, different countries got around this decrease in tariff restrictions من خلال ان that they used the non-tariff barriers. And when we study the different types of non-tariff barriers, we would always try to understand, as we have done for the tariffs, what is the effect of these different types on the different groups inside the economy, and how would this effect interact together to end up with the overall welfare effect. And we need also to understand what are the difference between the effects of or the impact of these different types, and also the difference between the effects of the non-tariff barriers versus tariffs. We will start the first part of the chapter with the import quotas. As I've mentioned, we will cover many types of non-tariff barriers in terms of their definitions, their effect, what is the difference between these types and the tariffs, and so on. So our first type that we are going to cover is the import quota. So generally, what is a quota? A quota is a direct quantitative restriction on the amount of a commodity allowed to be imported or exported. This means that quotas, أو اللي بنسميها بالعربي نظام الحصص, it could be applied both on imports as well as on exports. So when we say an import quota, لما بنقول حصة على الواردات، ده معناه ايه؟ What does this mean? It means a direct quantitative restriction on the amount of a commodity allowed to be imported. In other words, we are applying like a maximum, a ceiling on the amount of the good that is allowed to enter the country in a certain year. So the government would determine this amount as a maximum amount that could be imported and enter the country. وبالتالي ده معناه ان الحكومة بتسمح فقط بدخول كمية معينة كسقف، كمية قصوى من السلعة ان هي تدخل كواردات الى الدولة. As you can see, this is very obvious, that a very obvious difference between quotas and tariffs. Tariffs are a price restriction, while quota is a quantitative restriction. التعريفة الجمركية هي نوع من أنواع القيود السعرية، بينما التعريفة أو نظام الحصص هو عبارة عن quantitative أو قيود كمية وليست سعرية. many factors are determined to support applying a quota, like protecting a certain industry or supporting the balance of payments, and many other factors that we will cover, as I've mentioned, at the end of this chapter. So starting from this slide, we will try to analyze the impact of applying the import quota or imposing the import quota in nation 2, which is exporting good X. So here we will have the same example as we have seen in chapter 8 when we analyzed the impact of imposing the 100% ad valorem tariff. So we have a country, which is nation 2, exporting good X, that would apply an import quota on good X. And we need to examine the impact of imposing this import quota on the different groups inside the economy in terms of consumers, producers, importers, the government, and then the overall economy. We are also going to compare the effect of the import quota with the effect of the tariff to see the difference between them. As we have always agreed, to analyze the impact of anything, we need to compare two situations, which is the situation without the, the action that we are examining and the situation after applying the action that we are examining. So again, here for the import quota, we are going to compare the situation under free trade in nation 2 with the situation after imposing the import quota in nation 2. فهنا عندنا نفس الاكزامبل اللي شفناه لما كنا بنتكلم على التارفس في الشابتر اللي فات chapter 8. We here have the dx at the domestic demand curve for good x inside nation 2, and we have sx, which is the domestic supply curve for good x in nation 2. Under free trade, the price that will prevail inside nation 2 would be the international price or the world price of good x, which is $1, and this corresponds to 70x as domestic consumption, which is equals to AB, which is indicated with the green rectangle as you can see. This is the intersection of the price line at $1 with the domestic demand curve dx. Of this 70x, we have 10x, which is AC, or the red rectangle here, the part indicated with the red rectangle, as the domestic production, and hence the difference between the domestic production and the domestic consumption is the quantity imported, which is equals to 60x, or the segment CB indicated with the blue rectangle. زي ما احنا شايفين هنا انا بحاول ان انا اعوض فكره ان انا مش واقفه قدامكم وان انا بقدر اشاور بايدي على ال different parts that corresponds to consumption, production and imports and so on بالالوان المختلفه اللي احنا مستخدمينها هنا. فهنلاقي ان دايما الجرين color would indicate consumption, domestic consumption. The red color would indicate the red the domestic production, and finally the blue one indicates the imports أو الجزء اللي بيتم استيراده. فهنا بالضبط الوضع عندنا هنا is exactly the same as الوضع اللي كان we have seen already when we were analyzing the effect of the tariff. عندنا هنا the free trade situation أو الوضع في ظل حرية التجارة. the price that prevails, السعر اللي بيسود داخل nation 2 is the international price P1, وبالتالي بينظروا same consumption which is 70x as domestic consumption منها 10x as domestic production, والفرق بينهم اللي هو الجزء البلو عندنا هنا 70x as the imports. This slide here shows the situation after applying the import quota. We here assume that the government will apply an import quota equals to 30x, meaning that the quantity allowed to be imported inside nation 2 from good X is only 30x. This is the maximum amount that is allowed to enter the country. only 30x. The first and the direct impact on the economy after applying this import quota is an increase in the price, and the new price would be $2, as we can see by the red arrow in the figure. The price increased from $1, which is the international price, to $2, which is now the new price that prevails inside nation 2. However, why do we have this price at 2? Why the new price is not, for example, $2.5, $3, $1.5? Why exactly this $2? The reason is that at this price and only this price would the quantity demanded domestically be equal to the quantity supplied domestically plus the imports of 30x. At any other price, the quantity demanded would not be equals to domestic supply plus 30x. It would be different. بمعنى ان عند اي سعر تاني غير the price of 2 هنلاقي ان كمية الواردات لا تساوي 30x، وبالتالي الكوانتيتي demanded دايما هيكون بيقابلها كمية واردات مختلفة عن ال 30x عند الأسعار التانية. Only at this price of 2 هنلاقي in the quantity imported, which is the difference between the domestic demand and the domestic supply, equals to the 30x, which is the import quota allowed. So how would this increase in the price from $1 to $2 per unit resulting from the imposition of the import quota of 30x affects domestic demand and domestic supply inside nation 2? As you can see from the figure, at the price of 2, the domestic demand, the new domestic demand corresponding to the $2, which is equals to GH, it is equals to 50x. This means that the domestic demand decreased by 20x, which is equals to the green part indicated by the green rectangle BN. Of this 50x as domestic demand, we have 20x as domestic supply, which is indicated by the intersection of the price line at $2 with the domestic supply curve, which is equals to GJ. This means that the increase in the price led to an increase in the domestic production, which is equals to 10x, indicated by the segment CM and highlighted by the red rectangle. So زي ما احنا شايفين imposition of the import quota واللي ترتب عليه زيادة في السعر أدى إلى انخفاض domestic demand الاستهلاك المحلي بقيمة 20x، وأدى إلى زيادة domestic supply بقيمة 10x أو 10x. This is exactly the same effect of the imposition of 100% ad valorem tariff that we have seen in chapter 8. If you remember in chapter 8, and after the imposition of the 100% ad valorem tariff, what happened was an increase in the price to $2 and correspondingly a decrease in domestic consumption by 20x and an increase in the domestic supply or production by 10x. Why do we have this similarity in the effects? ليه عندنا نفس التأثير اللي حصل للconsumption والproduction domestically نتيجة the imposition of the quota and the imposition of the tariff؟ ليه الاثنين ليهم نفس التأثير على الاستهلاك وعلى الإنتاج المحلي؟ ده بيرجع إلى أن الاثنين أدوا إلى نفس الزيادة في السعر. In both cases, the price was $1 before imposition of the restriction, and after the imposition of the restriction, سواء كانت the import quota or the ad valorem tariff of 100%, the price increased to $2. So this same price increase led to the same effects on domestic demand and the domestic supply. طيب, the question that we would ask ourselves right now is that how would imposing the import quota affect the government? Would there be any benefits to the government from imposing the import quota? If you remember, when the government imposes the import tariff in chapter 8, it had some benefits in the shape of the revenues that it collected due to the tariff. However, for import quotas, would there be benefits? And if there would be benefits, how? So to start with, there is nothing to guarantee that the government would yield benefits or revenues from the imposition of the quota. This will depend on how the government distribute the quota among the different importers. Because now we have a certain quantity, a maximum quantity of the good which is allowed to enter the country. Many importers will try to import that quantity. So how would the government distribute these quantities among the different importers? Usually this is done through license. Usually the government would give a license to the different importers to import a certain amount of these 30x, so that the total of the license would be the 30x. One of the best ways to distribute this license would be to auction the license بالمزاد. The different importers would bid for the license, and the license would be given in a very competitive market to the higher or the highest bidder. So if we assume that this is the case, that the government in nation 2 will auction the 30x as import of the good X among the different importers, and that it ended up giving the license in the fees of the license of $1 per unit of X. So this means that the total amount that it will be collecting is the $1 times the quantity imported, which is 30x. So this means that the overall revenue to the government would be 30x, which is the amount of the fees, $1 equals to JM times the quantity imported, which is JH. This will give us the rectangle JHNM, which is equals to $30, and this is the rectangle indicated in purple in our figure. فبمعنى آخر عشان نقدر نفهم إن أنا دلوقتي بقول إن هل الحكومة هتحقق revenues نتيجة الإمبورت كوتا ولا لأ؟ بالنسبة للتارفs we are sure that the government will yield revenues. لكن في حالة الكوتاز this is not necessarily true. Sometimes the government would yield some revenues and sometimes not. فممكن الجفرمنت إن هي توزع الإمبورت كوتا اللي هي بتحددها بطرق مختلفة. لان احنا دلوقتي عندنا كميه محدده من السلعه بيسمح دخولها الى الدوله. طيب مين يقدر يحدد كل امبورتر هيستورد قد ايه من الكميه بتاعه ال 30 اكس المحدده دي؟ هل واحد بس هيستورد ال 30 اكس كلهم، ولا ال 30 اكس هتتوزع على اكثر من مستورد؟ عاده بيتم توزيع ال 30 اكس على المستوردين المختلفين باستخدام نظام ترخيص. بندي ترخيص للمستوردين المختلفين بكميات مختلفة من ال 30x بحيث ان مجمل التراخيص يبقى هو ال 30x. طيب ازاي بقى الترخيص ده بيتم منحه للمستوردين المختلفين؟ ازاي؟ One of the best ways، واحدة من افضل الطرق اللي بيتم بيها توزيع التراخيص دي على المستوردين بتكون عن طريق نظام المزادات، ان بيتفتح مزاد والمستوردين المختلفين بيراهنوا في هذا المزاد والترخيص بيروح او بيتوزع وفقا ل كل واحد فيهم بيدي بيد قد ايه، اللي بيدي البيد الاعلى بياخد ايه؟ الترخيص. فلو احنا هنا عندنا افتراض ان التراخيص اتوزعت بحيث ان كل يونت من الواردات بتاعه اكس كان مقابل الترخيص بتاعها او كانت الفيز بتاعه الترخيص بتاعها $1، يبقى ده معناه ان المجمل اللي هيدخل للحكومه الريفينيو الكلي بتاع الترخيص هيكون $30، لان هو هيساوي ايه؟ هيساوي $1 اللي هي الفيز بتاعه كل وحده بيتم استيرادها مضروبه في الكميه الكليه للواردات اللي هي 30x، وبالتالي we will end up with the same revenue to the government as the revenue collected by the government if it has applied 100% ad valorem tariff. However, this is not necessarily again true. مش بالضرورة أبدا إن الريفينيوز بتاع الإمبورت كوتا of 30x هيساوي الريفينيوز بتاع التارف الاد فالورم تارف of 100%. ليه؟ لأن مش بالضرورة إن الحكومة تجمع $1 مقابل الترخيص لكل وحدة بيتم استيرادها. ممكن تبقى بتجمع أو بتكولكت أقل من $1، فلو كان أقل من $1 يبقى التوتال ريفينيو هيبقى أقل من 30x. ممكن تكون بتلم أعلى من $1، بتلم الوحدة الواحدة $1.50 مش $1، وبالتالي 1.5 في 30 هتبقى أكيد أكبر من ال 30x أو سوري ال $30 اللي بتتجمع لو أنا بعمل import tariff equals to 100% ad valorem tariff. يبقى to summarize, the import quota of 30x would be equivalent in every aspect to an implicit 100% import tariff if we assume that the government would collect $1 for each of the 30x imported as fees of the license. However, please make sure that you understand that this is not necessarily the situation. If the government is collecting less than the $1, then the government revenue will be less than the $30. If it is collecting more than $1 per unit of imports as a return for the license, then it will collect more than the $30 collected by the 100% ad valorem tariff. So, as we have seen in the previous slides, the impact of an import quota and the impact of an import tariff would sometimes be the same. However, this depends on some factors. It mainly depends on the increase in the price resulting from the import quota and from applying the import tariff. If the increase in the price was the same under both restrictions, then the effect of both restrictions on domestic production and domestic consumption would be the same. Moreover, for the impact of these restrictions on the government revenue, we have seen that yes, sometimes the impact would be the same. However, this would also depend on the way the government distributes the import quota and the fees it gets in return for distributing these import quota. What we will try to do now is a little bit different, something different. We are going to try to analyze how would a change in the domestic demand, and in specific an increase in the domestic demand resulting in a shift in the domestic demand curve, would affect our equilibrium in terms of consumption and production and imports under both the import quota and the import tariff. So let's start with the import quota, and here we are assuming that the domestic demand increased. So we have a shift in the domestic demand curve from the previous original black one, dx, to the new blue one, d-x. So under an import quota, what would be the first immediate effect of this increase in the demand? The immediate effect and the direct effect would be an increase in the price from 2 to $2.5 per unit of X. Why specifically $2.5 per unit of X? Why not increasing to 3? Why not increasing to 2.25? Why exactly this 2.5? Again, the increase to 2.5 is explained by the fact that we have to keep the amount of imports equals to 30x, which is the import quota. The government would not allow a different amount to be imported. It will not allow a higher amount, for example. So we have to reach the price that corresponds to the new demand, but yet keep the quota or the quantity imported equals to 30x. And this only happens at the price of $2.5 per unit. At any other price, you will find that the difference between the new demand, d-x, and the domestic production, sx, is different than 30x. So the imports would be different than 30x. So only at this 2.5 would we keep the amount of imports equals to the import quota of 30x. So our new equilibrium price now is $2.5 per unit. Accordingly, and at this price, the new domestic demand would be equal to G-H-, which is equals to 55 units of X, which is indicated by the green part here. And of this 55X, the domestic production would be 25X, which is equals to G-J-, which is the amount indicated by the red rectangle here. Accordingly, in this case, the total or the increase in demand was totally covered by the increase in the production, domestic production, based on the increase in the price. So here we have the increase in the demand by 5x, which is the difference between the 50x that were consumed according to the previous demand curve dx, and the new consumption consumed according to the new demand curve D-X, we have an increase of 5x in demand. These were totally covered by the increase in the production from 20x to 25x. Now in this slide we need to see how would the shift in the demand curve, the increase in the demand curve from dx to d-x would affect the economy, the consumption and production if we are applying an import tariff instead of the import quota, if we are applying the 100% import tariff as we have done in chapter 8. As you can see here, the shift from dx to d-x would reflect immediately not in an increase in the price, because here there is nothing to force us to keep the amount of imports equal to the 30x. The adjustment here would be in terms of the imports and the quantity demanded. So what will happen is that we will find that the price will remain at 2. The price will remain equals to $2 per unit. What will happen is that we will have a new quantity demanded, which is equals to GK, which is equals to 65x, the green one here, the green area of the green rectangle here. And of this 65x, we have domestic production equals to 20x, which is the same as before the increase in the demand. There is nothing to make the domestic production increases. The supply curve still intersect with the price line at the same quantity, which is equals to GJ, which is equals to 20 units. But we have an increase in the quantity imported, which is the difference between the new demand, the new quantity demanded, which is 65, and the domestic production, which is 20. So here we have an imports equals to 45x, which is equals to JK, which is indicated by the blue rectangle here. So what happened? When the demand increased, or the demand curve shifted to D-X under the imposition of 100% ad valorem tariff, was an adjustment through the quantity demanded and through the imports. The imports increased to satisfy the increase in the demand that happened. However, domestic consumption is the same, and however, domestic production is the same, and the price would stay the same. The adjustment here is not through the change in the price, but through the change in the quantity imported. This is totally different than what we have seen for the import quota. As for the import quota, since we cannot change the amount imported, the adjustment was through the increase in the price. There were an increase in the price, an increase in the domestic production, and an increase in the domestic demand, but the amount of imports was the same. Here what we see is that there is no change in the price. The adjustments were through the increase in the imports to satisfy the increase in the demand. Accordingly, in this case, the case of the 100% import tariff, the increase in demand was totally covered by the increase in imports, while the domestic production stayed fixed or constant. It did not change. So as we have seen that the demand increased by 15x, it increased from 50x under the previous original demand dx to 65x under the new demand d-x. So we have the total increase in demand of 15x. This whole 15x were covered by the increase in imports that increased from 30x to 45x. We can conclude from the previous analysis and from the previous slides that there exists some differences, some important differences between the import quotas and the import tariffs. As we have seen, the shift of the demand curve from dx to d-x points to one of several important differences between import quotas and an equivalent import tariff. In what follows, we will try to identify and clarify some of these important differences between the two types of restrictions, and we will classify them into four main differences. First of all, number one, we have seen that the shift in the demand curve to the right, the same shift, the demand curve to the right from dx to dx dash, resulted in a higher domestic price and a greater domestic production under the import quotas than under the equivalent import tariff. While under a given import tariff, the same increase in the demand left prices and domestic production unchanged, but increased domestic consumption and imports than under the equivalent import quota. Accordingly, we can conclude that since the adjustments to any shift in the demand or the supply occurs in the domestic price with an effective import quota, but in the quantity of imports under an import tariff, we can say that therefore quota completely replaces the market mechanisms rather than simply altering it. As we have seen that the import quota led to an increase in the price that was reflected in an increase in the domestic production. The second difference between the import quota and the equivalent import tariff is related to the certainty about the quantity of import that will enter the country under both types of restrictions. So we would say that under an import quota, the amount of imports that is specified to enter the country and the estimate of the amount of the import is very certain. It is very accurate because this is a quantitative restriction. What the quota does is that it specifies a certain amount of the imports that should enter the country, not more than that. So the level of import is specified with a very high level of certainty. However, this is not the case under import tariff, because under the import tariff, there is a very high level of uncertainty concerning the amount of imports that will enter the country after imposition of the tariff. This could be explained by two main factors. The first factor is related to the elasticities of the demand and supply for the good. If you remember, we have seen that after the imposition of the tariff, this is reflected in an increase in the price, and after this increase in the price, the quantity demanded inside the country of the domestic demand respond by decreasing the quantity demanded, which is reflected in a decrease in the amount of import that will enter the country. However, this response of the domestic demand and the imports to the increase in the price is related to the elasticities of the demand and supply. However, no one could claim that the elasticities of demand and supply could be estimated with a high level of certainty. There are always uncertainties related to the estimations of the elasticities of demand and supply, and hence this is reflected in uncertainty in the response expected of the demand, domestic demand, and the imports to the increase in the price that resulted from the imposition of the tariff. And hence, this uncertainty about the elasticities of demand and supply is reflected in an uncertainty concerning the estimated amount of imports that will enter the country due to the imposition of the tariff. The second factor is related to foreign exporters and tariffs. Sometimes foreign exporters may try to absorb the effect of the imposition of the tariff, which would lead to an increase in the imports of the country, by decreasing the price by which the country imposing the tariff will import the goods. This would happen specifically in the case where we have a big country imposing a tariff on the good, because in this case, if it is a big country in the international markets, then the imposition of the tariff and the increase in the domestic price and the related decrease in the quantity of imports will affect the international markets. In this case, sometimes foreign exporters in the other countries that are exporting the good to the nation would try to offset this effect by decreasing their prices. So instead of having the $1 price in the international market, in our example, maybe it will decrease to $0.75 or 75 cents, or maybe 50 cents. If this happened, then the decrease in the imports will not be the 30x that we have seen. The decrease in the imports will be less than 30x. So the imports will end out to be not only 30x, but could be 40x, for example. So here they tried to offset the effect of the tariff by decreasing their prices. And how would they decrease their price? They could decrease their prices through increasing their efficiency and hence decreasing the costs, or through decreasing their profits. In all cases, this will result in an uncertainty related to the amount of imports that will enter the country based on the tariff. However, exporters cannot do this with an import quota, since the quantity of imports allowed into the nation is already classified by the quota, and it is not related to the price of the international markets by any means. The third difference between import quotas and equivalent import tariff is related to the efficiency of these two types of restrictions, as quotas may be less efficient and cause corruption as compared to the equivalent import tariffs. Why is this? Why would we say that import quota may involve some corruption while the equivalent import tariff does not? As we have seen that there are different methods through which the government can allocate the import license and can or distribute the quotas using import license. So import quota involves the distribution of import license, while tariff does not. There is no distribution of any license concerned to under the tariffs. So if these import quotas and their distribution by the license is not auctioned by the government in a competitive market, the receiving firms may reap monopoly profits, meaning that some firms would be the only firms that will import the good, and hence they will have some monopoly profits. Moreover, the allocation decision is based on sometimes on arbitrary judgments rather than efficiency concerns, meaning that, as we have said, the import license should be allocated, should be distributed among the different importers. However, how should they be allocated? How should they be distributed? If it is not distributed using an auction, then sometimes it will just be distributed through the government officials, who may sometimes just allocate them based on their preferences and based on getting any bribery or any type of connections and networks with the different importers, and hence this would lead to corruption and would affect efficiency very negatively. Moreover, these monopoly profits that may result from the import license may intensify or incentivize firms to lobby for license in a rent-seeking activities through lobbying, through giving supporting different government officials, supporting their campaigns in any of the political activities and so on. Thus, import quotas replace the market mechanisms, resulting in wastes and inefficiencies and possible corruption, as compared to the tariff that does not involve any licensing and any distribution of license, and then there is no room for corruption or for arbitrary judgments and networking. Finally, the fourth and the last difference between an import quota and an equivalent import tariff is related to the visibility of these restrictions and hence the preference of the different groups inside the economy for these different types of restrictions. Import quota, as we have seen, is less visible than the import tariff, and hence domestic producers prefer them over tariffs. What does this mean? What do we want to say here? We want to say that, as we have seen, producers will always benefit from applying any type of restriction, being it an import quota or an import tariff. However, the import tariff is more visible. Consumers usually notice import tariffs. It is not that easy to be hidden. So, generally, domestic producers would prefer the government to apply an import quota to protect their industry than imposing an import tariff to protect the same industry, because the import quota would give them the same protection or maybe even a more certain protection. However, it is less visible to the society and to the consumers. That's why um, the society should resist domestic producers' effort to use quotas instead of tariffs. Tariffs is more visible, tariffs is more efficient, and is more easier to be monitored, and so on. So usually the society and the consumers would prefer import tariffs than import quotas, as opposed to the producers who would prefer import quotas to protect their industries compared to import tariffs. This will be the end of this lecture. Next time, inshallah, we'll continue chapter 9. We have two main parts still remaining from chapter 9. The first part is the other non-tariff barriers and the new protectionism that involves voluntary export restraints, technical, administrative, and other regulations, international cartels, dumping, and export subsidies. And then we will shift to the political economy of protectionism, which covers the different arguments that protectionism is based on. Why do people call for protectionism? What is the difference between their arguments and what the proponents of free trade say, and so on. So this is what we are going to cover in our next lecture. Please note that this lecture, the one that I have covered today, is for both Monday the 23rd and Wednesday the 25th of March. So this covers the two lectures for this week. Next week we will inshallah continue and finish chapter 9. I hope everything was clear in this lecture. If you have any problem, don't hesitate to contact me on my email and also on Mrs. Radwa's email, and we'll happily answer you. Stay safe and take care. Thank you.